Nia Clowet, Shia Clowet, Tots Clowet, good evening. Thank you, James, my friend. Usually, if he was saying all of that without you present, I'd say, what do you want? But we've collaborated long enough that we talk a lot on the phone, and we're usually scheming together. I want to thank you for coming tonight and having curiosity about this subject matter, tribal place names here. And I want to thank my fellow tribal members for being here, and for some of the people whose families have provided some of the knowledge. And Gary, it's great to see you. I haven't seen you since before the pandemic, at least. Sergeant Gass needs to come around. This flag that's on the first slide is the Confederated Tribes flag. We're a modern nation state, but that's not what we used to be. We didn't used to have boundaries for Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We didn't used to have counties like we have today. And part of what we tried to do in this book that was published in 2015, that's in the museum store here, in the gift shop, is erase those boundaries so that we could look at history before those boundaries existed. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about tonight. And this flag represents the Confederacy, these three tribes. But the thing that's most important about this Confederacy that was arranged for us by the United States government for its own convenience in making a treaty with us is that, for me, of course, the center of the story is horses, but that's because I'm a horse lover. But the Confederacy is actually a relationship between three linguistic speaking groups, the Umatilla or Umatilla, the Walla Walla or Walulapum and Chemnapum, and the Cayuse people. And those relationships did not exist in a formal governmental way until the treaty-making process occurred. And so this flag is what we carry when we want to be recognized as a modern tribal government that has a relationship with not only all of the federal government agencies with whom we do business, but with state governments and municipal and county governments. And this is important to us because as a tribal government, we're representing the interests of our tribal community, our tribal membership, and it's not a club. It is an odd thing to be a member of a club that's based on your ancestry and your genealogy by blood quantum, because that construct did not exist in our history. It's a construct that was also given to us by the United States government, and so being enrolled in the Confederated Tribes does mean I'm a member of that group. I'm a voting citizen, and my way of thinking of this nation state, the confederacy of these three tribes, is that I'm a citizen of this nation, and we are a nation within the United States. So I have dual status in my mind. I'm a citizen of this tribe and a citizen of this country. So this is where you see us today on the Umatilla Reservation, and it's a very interesting thing to see the states and this dark brown area with the light kind of fading out. This is a data density map. This basically shows you the homeland as well as where we lived and traveled over those 16,000 years that James has referred to. And so you can see our people went into Northern California to what's now called Fort Sutter. Our people went into the southern British Columbia area before we went there as migrants to pick apples. We traveled all around this country. The Snake River takes us all the way into what's now called Wyoming, and we went over the mountains. In school you learn that the first explorers in this area were Lewis and Clark. People tend not to think of Indians as explorers who went over the mountain. And let me tell you, when you look at our genealogy, you know that your grandparents went over the mountains. So we end up with what's called Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla ancestry, but it's actually much more complicated than that, and much harder to pronounce, too. This area is sort of the heartland. This is the focus of our homeland. And when you look at the dark, this is the densest data, and what this data density is native place names. So actually, if we had been able to do this work 100 years ago, that data density would be much broader and much more intense in a lot of these areas that are light, because we've lost some of the data. And not that it's not something we can get back. It's something that we keep finding and discovering as we go through our daily work, when we talk to folks who've not told us their stories yet, but it's not a lot of data. So we have in this publication that I'm using as a reference book about 670 place names, and that's for this tribal heartland, and they're in 4 different dialects or languages. I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is one of our elders who passed away a number of years ago. Some of you may know her as Cecilia Bercham. Her Indian name is Kumpnai. She worked at Whitman Mission for a number of years, and she went back to college after she'd retired from a couple of different careers in raising a family. But she was one of the early planners on the Tamástslikt Cultural Institute project. And when I traveled with her a lot of places over time, she kept reminding me it's not time to tell coyote stories yet when we travel, especially in the summer. So it's now getting into fall. Rumor has it there's been a freeze someplace. I don't know, because it wasn't at my house. And that we haven't really had snow fly yet. And so when the snow flies, then it's time to tell coyote stories. So I'm going to give you sort of an encapsulated or a brief summary of some of what we call Walchaishma or Walsaishma, the myth time stories. So these are land formations, and in common English, we'd call them Elephant Rock, the Sisters. This is Iskoktpa up in the Blue Mountains, used to be called the Squaw Creek Overlook. And this is where we look towards your country over here, look through the Blue Mountains towards this landscape. And these images represent what we would call ancestor watchers. So these are ancestors who are in these forms or occupying these places where these forms are, who keep watch over the Columbia River, who keep watch over our homeland. And at one time, they were people. Now, when I say at one time they were people, they could have been 4-legged people or 2-legged people or winged people, but they were living beings. And they're all along the Columbia River system. These mythic times gave us these sentinels all across the homeland. So the Sawtooth Mountains and why they look the way they look is a coyote story. A lot of the landforms here, if there's a place on the Columbia River on the Washington side as you're going towards Portland on Interstate 84, where if you pay close enough, and don't do it while you're driving, but if you pay close enough attention as a passenger on the Washington side, you might see a coyote tail in one of the talus slopes. There's a story about abalone woman's tears that goes with that landform. So there's a lot of stories along this landscape, and these sentinels live all over this landscape. So if you're alone in the mountains, or you're just a few of you in the mountains, you might feel that you're not alone. Well, you're not. I guarantee it, you're not alone. These sentinels are still here. And for us, they're not myths as if they're fairy tales. They're myths, and they're true, and they're real. It's history, not mythology, in the sense that we're telling tall tales. This is a tenet of our culture. This is an aspect of our history that is real. And if you're one of those people, when you hike and walk across this landscape, you feel the changes in the landscape. You can feel the presence of other beings. And just be mindful that we also believe that rocks have lives. They're not inanimate objects. They have stories of their own, and they create change. About a couple decades, more than that, some of you may have seen this lying around. We distributed at least 100,000 of these maps. But they were part of what we wanted to identify as a heritage corridor. So you see the bend in the Columbia River, and you see where we have sort of a figure 8 on the landscape, and you can see Walla Walla kind of at the middle of that junction at the 8. And you see Tamástslikt at the bottom, and the Snake River going up. This representation of place names was one of the earliest place name maps we put out to the public. And what we wanted people to know is that this is a storied landscape. That it's not just the Lewis and Clark story or the Oregon Trail story. There are lots of stories. Every one of these place names has an interesting story. And we're going to go to Highway 730 for a few minutes to, if I get this right, to this place here called, which you can't really see, maybe we could hit the focus button on that a little bit, but right up here is where the sisters are. The basalt pillars known as the Cayuse sisters, they've been referred to as the Cayuse twins before, but I want to correct that just a little bit by telling you a little bit of a coyote story. Coyote is always present, and this isn't just the one you see in your barnyard near your chicken coop. This isn't the coyote that you see crossing the highway. This is the big mythic coyote, Ispilii. Ispilii is the average guy. Ispilii, with the little eye, teeny eye in the front of it, is the mythic guy. And he is always present, and he's either going up the river or down the river, but he's always going. And one time he was near this place on the river, the big bend in the river, and he saw beautiful sisters, and he fell in love. And coyote is the mirror of the human condition. He does everything we can do. In one story, he can be industrious, brilliant, lazy, slothful, and stupid. All in one story. So he's the mirror of who we are. And he saw these beautiful girls, and he wanted them to stay. And they were fishing. They had a fish trap. They had a weir on the river, and they were fishing for their families who lived inland from this location on the river. And every day they would catch salmon, and they'd empty it out of the fish weir, and then they would set it again, and they'd go to bed hoping to get fish that night. And the goal was to dry and store this fish to feed their families for the rest of the year. He would watch for them to go to bed, and he would go and he would empty the weir every night for 5 nights. So I'm not going to go through the whole story because it's a colorful story. But when they'd check their traps, at first they were annoyed and disappointed. They became more frustrated, and over the number of nights that it happened, they became distraught, and they were weeping by the 5th time that they discovered an empty fish weir because their family would starve. This was a very sad moment for them, that they had failed in their mission on behalf of their family. And so while they were carrying on, commiserating with one another, Coyote, who can take many forms, revealed himself to them and told these lovely sisters that if they would stay with him forever, he would fish for them, and their families would be fat and full, and that they would be good providers because they were with Coyote. So they agree to take care of their families. He may not be the handsomest guy, but he's going to take care of their families, so they agree. And after a while, the same guy who's been so convincing, who's never completely content, is always worried that a more handsome man, a richer man, someone more inviting and humorous will come along and steal away the hearts of one of these girls. And so he doesn't want to use his precious, beautiful wives. So he decides to turn them to stone. And this is a little bit of a lascivious story. I don't see any 4th graders here. But these stones, these basalt pillars, represent the human anatomy of a female. And there is a cave below these 2 basalt pillars. And you can imagine what that is. He turned the 3 sisters to these 3 landmarks. Now, because of the water level, the cave is covered. The cave is not visible to us. Only the basalt columns are, which is why they're often called the twins. But it's a story about 3 beautiful sisters and 5 miserable nights of dumping fish out of their fish weir. Coyote also isn't just happy to turn themselves to stone. He wants to look at them forever. So he also turns himself to stone on the other side of the river. And believe me, there are lots of us who have sat and looked across the river and tried to figure out which rocks he is, or whether he's still there. But he is present. He's present in this story. The sentinels are there and they're watching. So here you see a historic representation, an early photography of this landscape. And you see a more recent photograph, it's still a historic one, but you see the basalt columns. These have been climbed. These have had a high wire act erected between the two of them. I think you may have seen that image as well, where someone does a high wire walk between the two as a local stunt. And here's a more recent one. And please remember these flowers, because we're going to come back and talk about them in just a minute. But this is the Cayuse sisters. So when you see two of them, remember that there are three. This is harder, and I apologize for you to see. But what you probably recognize is the bend in the Columbia River over here to the west. And you see, this is the Walla Walla Basin in here. I want to talk about this landscape just briefly. The Confederated Tribes of Umatilla has in its homeland multiple river basins. The Walla Walla Basin is one of the banana belts. The other banana belt is the Imnaha. So where we went to winter, for winter villages, were in places where the climate was temperate and where we were out of the nasty winds of the Columbia River and much of the rest of the plateau. And so when you look at this, we're river people down low in the wintertime, and by spring and summer, we're moving out into the foothills and the uplands of our territory and into the mountains. And when you look at this waterway that kind of makes its way through here along with, I'll go to the next slide, maybe we can see it better. Whoops. We can see it better. This brown polygon in here is the Walla Walla Valley for the most part. And what you see there is still the edge of the Columbia River that way and the mountains this way. And this polygon has a lot of important places and a lot of riverways in it. One of the most remarkable things about our history in this landscape is that we are people of many rivers. Not just the main stem Columbia and the big tributary, the Snake. All of the other rivers in this homeland were critical to our lifestyle and our survival. And so you see here, not just the Walla Walla, you see the Touchie, the Tucannon, Dry Creek, and many others. And so I want to talk a little about some of these names, and I'll see if I can move out of the way. Over here is Touchie. And most people who see that sign that says Touchet think that it's French in origin. It's not. It actually comes from a really long old story, again, about Coyote, of course, and the Swallow sisters. And it has to do with roasting. He's roasting salmon over a fire. And of course, he's a braggart, and his fish gets eaten by other people, and Fox is involved, his brother Fox, and lots of other characters in this story. But that name is a subset of that storyline about Coyote being stupid, wanting all the salmon, and not getting any of the salmon over the roasted fire because he goes to sleep. Right next to it is another place you see here, Shkui, and this place is on what's, it's right here on the river, and what you don't realize about that name is it means having deep cuts. So where the river has velocity and curves and sinuous path, it makes deep banks in that earth, and that's what that name refers to, is the deep banks in the river. And of course, when the river spreads out like a floodplain, it doesn't leave us those deep banks. So some of the things that these names refer to may or may not exist in current time. And right next to it, right here, is Pawak-Yushpa, which means where the creek ends. And it's really talking about, it's near the mouth of the Tushi River, but it's talking about a place where there was a lot of edible fruit and where we camped. There was a lot of firewood in this location, and it was a good place to be when the intense heat of the summer was affecting livelihood, and it's on an open stretch of river. Then if you come up the Walla Walla here, you see Wailet, and that has to do, Wailet, according to our linguists, means undulating or wavy, according to the early Whitman story, it's place of the ryegrass, but it's actually about sort of waving or undulating movement there, which could be rye or any other grass that's blowing in the wind there. But that's Wailet. And then you see Watnawash, and Watnawash has a very important spiritual location. This is a spirit-seeking place, and so it's a ceremonial place. And then here you get closer to the town of Walla Walla. Pashka, that's those balsam root sunflowers you saw in the twin sisters photograph, those yellow sunflowers. That's the arrowleaf balsam root, and that is what Pashka means. So a while back, somebody was looking for the name of sort of the Wine Valley corridor here, and we suggested sunflower, but it was not popular. I think they chose another name. But Pashka or Pashkapa is the place of the sunflowers, and that's where you live. That's part of your history here. And this place, Sahaptian, is a funny story. Old ladies used to love to tell this story because it's about one man, probably in the 1800s, either mid to late 1800s, but somehow he wore his chaps or his leggings and his breechcloth, and he was on horseback, and he was coming through this area here in, I don't know, close trees, high brush, something. Somehow he managed to lose his legging up in this tree and couldn't get it down. And so it hung there, so this place became known as Hang It Up. That's what it means, Hang It Up place. And so not all of the names in the Place Names Atlas are about ancient stories. This is a very practical and humorous story. Himyuma here is also the name of one of our leaders who's passed away in the last couple of years, but it has the translation for that name is grizzly bear, not the youngest, not the oldest. So it doesn't mean middle grizzly bear, but it means grizzly bear sort of in the middle. And that probably is in story form elaborated on that the most prominent man who carried this name in past times was not the eldest brother, was not the youngest brother, but was the most prominent brother. So that's his name. And then let's see, we've got this name along the river here, which is Dry Creek, this polygon. It's not really the river, but it's along the river. This is an area that's been called Dry Creek before, but it used to be a place where there were lush meadows. And what the name is Siltwashnama, and it means where the buttonroot grows. And I'm not sure I'm getting the pronunciations right, so if you stream this, I'll get corrected. But it has to do with a root that we don't see on the longhouse table very often anymore, the buttonroot. They do occur in this landscape, but we don't always have access to the landscapes where they live. So this is the buttonroot place where the meadows used to be, and it was not a dry creek when they were plentiful there. So this valley has lots of stories that go with it, and these stories are not the same stories that are told necessarily. They're not all coyote stories, some are. Some of them are ancient, some of them are more modern. The one name I couldn't remember today when I was getting ready to come over, and I'll think of it probably after I stop talking, is a modern name. So those of you who know where the Passatempo Taverna is, where the pastime is, when our people used to come here during segregation, and we weren't welcome. The same time, Celilo had signs that said no dogs, no Indians in the windows of restaurants. We came here, and people from the tribes who came here would go to this Italian-owned food and beverage establishment, and they had a name for it, which I can't remember at this moment, and the name is blue-faced people. And it had to do with the 5 o'clock shadow of the waiters. And if you're going there, especially for dinner, the blue-faced people who had this 5 o'clock shadow, because historically a lot of our men did not have a lot of hair on their face. They did have hair, but if you can imagine, they plucked them one at a time, like women pluck their eyebrows. And so the blue 5 o'clock shadow is what the pastime's name is, the place of the blue-faced people. So it's a more modern name from the middle of the last century. This is a place you may know, Wallula. Wallula Junction is what most people experience now. Most people don't go to the town of Wallula or spend any time in the Marie Dorion Park or Marie Doroin Park there. But this was a stone that was excavated and moved in 1910. The Oregon Railroad Navigation Company moved it, and it ended up in Portland. And Vera Katz, when she was mayor, got it back to us in 1996. And it sits in the middle of our Veterans Memorial. And you can see on this the petroglyphs that are all over this stone. And they're not just on one side. And you can see that part of the stone has been lost through the movement and through time. Some of the edges show some chipping away, but it has a lot of petroglyphic representations and stories on it. And what's really interesting about this particular stone coming home, going from where it was in Wallula, going to Portland, and then coming back, is that there are some of us who firmly believe that this is a location that may have previously been called Council Rock. So before Isaac Stevens, the governor of the Washington Territory, and Joel Palmer, the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Oregon Territory, joined us here at what's now the VA campus for the Walla Walla Treaty Council, sort of VA campus all the way to Mill Creek and up to Whitman College, because there were thousands of us camped here, so it wasn't a small footprint. Before that, there had been meetings about the idea that this man or these men wanted to meet with us and talk about standing up a new law. And when tribes met at this location on the river, I'll show you sort of why it was so pivotal. If you look on the river, the proximity of the tribes. These are all villages, and these are trails. And look at the crossroads that's at Wallula Junction. So this is a way to access the people who are now considered Yakima, the people who are now considered Umatilla, the Snake River Nez Perce, the Walla Wallas and Chemnapums. This was a good location to have a council if you're going to have a council. And it's a good location if you know where and when to cross the Columbia River at this location. And there were meetings there. And so that Wallula stone coming home was a precious piece of history and an archaeological artifact, but it's also the power of the stone itself. There's power in that rock. There's power in the petroglyphs and the stories. And for it to come home so that the representation of this landscape could be known through that rock, through experiencing time with that rock, was important. You also see a couple of other polygons up here. This is sort of this rattlesnake formation, and you see Kusipama here, which is the Horse Heaven Hills, the edge of the Horse Heaven Hills. Kusi is horse. A long time ago, Kusi used to be dog, And when the horses came, they were domesticated, like we had also had domesticated dogs, and had had dogs for thousands of years and used them in hunting and for all kinds of purposes, not usually eating as other tribal peoples did. But this place, Cayuse got named, place of the horses, got named after the modern horse was acquired by our people. And dog became Cayuse, and the big horse, the big dog, is Cayuse. So we got a big dog and a little dog. And that's important because the name of this place is Walla Walla. So when Lewis and Clark came through this place, this name of the river here, Walla Walla, is actually the name of is the river, the waterway, not the name of the people, but the name stuck on the people. Because Lewis and Clark called them the Walla Walla, it became the name of the Walulapum people, the name of their language, but it actually means flow of water. So in the Walla Walla dialect, or Walulapum, Wana is a flow of water, big flow of water. So the big river, the Columbia, is Inchi, big, Wana, Inchiwana, big flow of water, and Walla Walla is a smaller flow of water. Changing the N to an L makes it smaller. Saying it twice either does one of two things or both. Diminutivizes it or pluralizes it. Now, if you've ever looked at the braids of the Walla Walla, especially if they flood, as they come together in that landscape below sort of the Juniper Canyon overlook, if you look at that, you can see the many streams or many fingers of water that make up the Walla Walla braided channel. And that's why it was called Walla Walla, because it was many small flowing streams of water. It was not the name of the people. So I'm not here really selling atlases, but I want you to know what's in them. This is what we called it. We called it Cáw Pawá Láakni. They are not forgotten. And this particular photograph that's on the cover of the book is really a story of abundance. These places that we talk about, that our elders talked about, that our parents talked about, and grandparents, these are all lamprey. Those things hanging on those drying racks, we call them eels commonly, but they're not really eels, they're lamprey. They're a prehistoric fish, and that is a lot of lamprey. And if you understand how oily they are, they're really rich in omega-3, as is salmon oil. And so these women, I think they're Barnhart girls, are standing in this, next to this camp with the wagon, with the racks on the Umatilla River, with all of those lamprey. And we've just recently, in the past decade and a half, reintroduced lamprey to the waterway. And what's interesting about it is that the reservation only has one river. So for people who lived on a lot of rivers, we have what I call the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla River, because we're all on this reservation around one about 93-mile long river, I think. And so this for us was a reminder that the story we tell today about 3 Mile, about the dam and the 3 Mile fish hatchery, it has a predecessor story. And that story is, yes, times were tough. Yes, we had times of scarcity, but we knew how to live on this land, and these species provided for us. So this is what the subset maps look like, the index page looks like. And it's really 45 maps laid across that brown heartland, the data density map, so that you can learn more about the place names. So if you live closer to Prescott or closer to Dayton or closer to Yakima or closer to John Day, those are in this book because they're part of our story and they all have place names. One of the places that's important to us here was celebrated in 2005. And it's a really odd local story. No one in the Confederated Tribes ancestry, no one in our genealogical trees wanted a treaty. Not a one. A treaty was an invitation to give up 92% of our homeland. And the treaty was an opportunity for us, according to the people we met with on behalf of the US government, to set aside a small place where we could be ourselves, temporarily, until we were mainstreamed into the general population and we understood the value of owning personal property instead of collective property, and we understood the value of personal wealth versus collective wealth. And so in that process, what happens is this law, the treaty, is stood up here on the grounds that are now Whitman campus and the Walla Walla VA. And this treaty that we agreed to was not something we wanted. And it's a fascinating story for us as tribal members because you know how you are with your elected officials and your leaders. You want them to go after the things you want, right? There were 36 X's by Native headmen on the treaty representing the Umatilla, Cayuse, and Walla Walla. The most outspoken were the Walla Walla and Cayuse representatives at this council. There were outspoken Nez Perces as well. There were outspoken Yakimas. But in this treaty council, an unknown part of the story for most people is that we were being punished. There had been, after we killed the Whitmans, a small group of Cayuse killed the Whitmans in 1847 in November. There was a peace commission of 3 men, including Joel Palmer, the Indian Affairs Superintendent from Oregon. And they listened to testimony from tribal people all over this region. And what they agreed at that time is that the Cayuse would give up any claim to land. They made that decision for us, that we would forfeit any land that might be coming our way in the future. Now, nobody on our side of the table agreed to that. There was no conference about that. There was no dialogue about that. That was just an intent coming out of the Peace Commission. We walk into the Treaty Council then in 1855, 8 years later after the Whitman killings. And the plan is that the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla will go to either the Yakima Reservation in what's now Washington or the Nez Perce Reservation in what's now Idaho. And one of the Nez Perce leaders comes back from a buffalo hunt and says, you can't, with all of your livestock, you Cayuses can't live with us. Your horses can't eat trees. I mean, we have timber. We're living in timber. And we have enough of our own horses. And you need a bigger place. So you're not going to live with us. Now, the Yakimas, there's 14 bands represented on the Yakima Reserve. That's a pretty big amalgamation of people in that confederacy. And while it's a large piece of land, it includes now restored part of Mount Adams, it's still not that big when you figure that we had 25,000 horses. So we were the largest livestock producing tribe in the United States in 1890. The only tribes that had more horses than us were big tribes, the Chickasaw and the Navajo, who had much larger populations of people. So per capita, every man, woman, baby, and elder had 11.4 horses, I think, with thousands of horses. And so we go into this treaty council where the goal is to put us on one of these 2 other reservations. And for Governor Stevens, this treaty that happened here in Walla Walla, this place, the story of this place, is a big deal. It was the longest, most protracted, most difficult treaty negotiation of all of the 10 treaties he worked on, from the Puget Sound to Glacier National Park in the Blackfeet country, because they wanted to cut the Cayuse out. And the Cayuse and the Walla Wallas were not agreeing to the plan. So in the 11th hour of the Treaty Council, they finally propose a 3rd reservation, which is now the Umatilla Reservation. That reservation is eked out in the final hours of the Treaty Council. Joel Palmer makes the presentation, and eventually our people agree to it. The peculiar thing is that what we agreed to, based on what we understood of the proceedings, was a different thing than the reservation became. So right now the reservation is about 172,000 acres, which is about 1/3 of what we were promised. We were promised 512,000 acres, or 800 square miles. According to our understanding of the treaty, it should start at 5 Points Creek. You know where Hillgard Park is? going south on Interstate 84 towards La Grande. That's one of the markers for where the edge of the reservation should be. That's on the other side of the mountain. It's not up at Meacham up on top. So there's a swath of land called what we call the east boundary, where one survey line cut off 250,000 acres. And most of it's, not all of it, but most of it's now U.S. forest land. For us, this treaty, we didn't want it. It wasn't our goal. But there were two triumphs in that treaty. And one of them was getting one where we got it in our homeland, not being exiled into some other people's country, getting it in our homeland on the Umatilla River, even though we didn't get to keep all the rivers, but we were trying to hang on to the Grand Ronde and the Umatilla and the Touchy. Those were named conversations in the Treaty Council. The original boundaries would have included more, not only more land, but more watershed, which is really, in particular, important for all the work we're doing in salmon restoration and other species restoration. So the watershed being cut off from the reservation, lowlands and foothills, was really important. So in 2005, the treaty was 150 years old. And we gathered here with our Nez Perce relatives, with some of our Yakima relatives, here in Walla Walla to commemorate the 150th anniversary of that treaty, because the second success in that treaty was actually a consequence of the government trying to be economical. And you know how well that works, right? So the government had this, we call them reserved rights. They're inherent rights that we've always had to hunt, fish, trap, graze, and gather foods and medicines in our homeland, including the ceded lands and open and unclaimed lands like the Forest Service land, and BLM land and Bureau of Reclamation land, those open and unclaimed lands, not entitled to your family. So when we reserved those rights in the Treaty Council, the reason the federal government agreed to it was because they thought it was cheaper. They wouldn't have to feed the Indians if we could feed ourselves. Not all tribes in the United States have reserved rights, but we do, and that is its own triumph, because we can still hunt, still fish, still trap, still graze, still gather our foods and medicines, and that reserved right is another one of the success stories of that Treaty Council that did not intend for us to have much at all. And so for us, there's an important place here, this council grounds, the treaty grounds, that pretty much took up from Home Depot to the other side of Walla Walla where the wineries are, for us to have about 7,000 to 10,000 tribal people camped in this valley to make those agreements. And this is what these men are here to represent. And so two of the men in the foreground here, these two have since passed away, but you see Antone Minthorn here, who is now, I believe, 87, who is still with us, Fred Hill, Gary Burke, who has succeeded his father as a chief, and others on horseback, commemorating what their ancestors and our ancestors did in the Treaty Council, which was to represent our people so that we could live our way of life forever. And it's, for us, that's a pretty amazing story. Most people don't realize that because we have cell phones and microwaves and drive cars and use all of our laptops and our laser pointers and all of that technology that we have, that we're still living according to some ancient teachings. And those teachings are one of the reasons I moved home when Y2K was threatening Northern California, and people were worried about banking and groceries. And it's like, if I go home, I know where there's wood, I know where there's meat, I know where there's fish. Not as many as there used to be, but I know where to get food. If I have to worry about groceries, I'm going home. I'm not staying on the Sacramento River where all I can get is catfish, because the salmon on the Sacramento aren't plentiful like they used to be. So this story of homeland, this story of place, and the story of every single place, even in modern time, this Walla Walla story permeates tribal discussions about the VA and the places here. The Whitman campus has a treaty stone. There's a few other markers around to this history. It doesn't matter if the markers are there or not. For us, this landscape is a place of many stories, and this is one of the more modern chapters, this nation-state chapter. And so with that, this is where we are at Tamástslikt if you want to come learn more. We're working on turning 25. Next year's our 25th anniversary, and we're hoping to have upgraded and updated our exhibits, our wayfinding signage that we've not had for 25 years since we opened. And we're looking forward to welcoming you to come back and see what's new at Tamástslikt next year. Thank you. Good to see you. Questions? Comments?
In the book, is there a pronunciation guide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there is. And I have to look it up too, so don't. We are teaching ourselves this language, and the pronunciation guide's right there in the front.
And that was my other question is, what about tribal language, and can you talk about, is there active teaching of the language?
So for a while, our tribal charter school is about 15 or 16 years old now, and we're teaching Walla Walla and Umatilla and Nez Perce for a while, but now the tribal language program, because Nez Perce is taught on 2 other reservations, it's taught with the Joseph Band at Colville, and it's taught on the Nez Perce Reservation in Idaho. Our education director, who is a linguist, has focused the efforts on teaching Umatilla. We have a dictionary in Walla Walla, we have a dictionary in Umatilla, and we have the Nez Perce dictionary that was created by a scholar who worked with our people and the Nez Perce people in multiple locations. The most amazing thing about that story is that if you like to use your phone or your tablet or your laptop, you can go to Google and look up the Umatilla dictionary. So you can look up the word for elk and the Google Umatilla dictionary, and it'll give you the 7 it'll pull from all of the pages in the dictionary 7 ways that elk is referred to with participles and pronouns and suffixes and prefixes added on and taken off. And so you can look up Umatilla words on any of your smart devices.
There's a copy also if you want to check it out in the Pendleton Library.
Yes. On the Umatilla, and we sell it at the museum store. And there's a Yakima dictionary, a Walla Walla dictionary. The Walla Walla dictionary is not in print, but we do have it available within the tribal government. I don't know that it's on the website. And then the Nez Perce dictionary is still available. It's rather expensive. It's quite a tome, but it's a pretty interesting read any day, if you like dictionaries.
The permanent display at Tamástslikt's beautiful.
Thank you.
It's worth the drive. It really is.
Thank you. Well, we're working on improving it. We have great gratitude for Sherwood Trust, who reached across the border and recognized that there's an entire section of our galleries, and Gary and others are familiar with this, but from the arrival of Lewis and Clark to the treaty is what I call the Walla Walla zone of our museum, because all of that history happened. Frenchtown is in there, Fort Nez Perce is in there. All of the stories of the Whitman Mission and all the way to Fort Walla Walla, all of that is in, and the treaty is all in that sort of zone. And the Sherwood Trust is supporting us updating and improving some of that, the graphics, the text, and the cases in those places. And so we're grateful for that support, because it is a Walla Walla story. And Walla Walla school students come, Whitman College students come, Walla Walla University students come, homeschool students come from this area, and we want them to see that in a more accurate and up-to-date fashion.
Great gift shop, too.
Thank you.
And cafe.
Thank you. Don't forget us for Christmas shopping. Yes?
Bobbie, any thoughts yet on the 175th anniversary?
No. It's interesting. There are a lot of anniversaries that come and go, and right now one of the projects we're working on, 2 of the projects we're working on are focused on Oregon City, and we're focused on finding the burial of the 5 Cayuse men who were hanged in Oregon City, and we're working with the University of Oregon Honors College on that. The second class of those students will occur this winter term. to help us with that research, which is great. Having young, enthusiastic, bright, technologically savvy students working to help us is great. And the other is we're working with the city of Oregon City on a tribute to the Cayuse 5 who were hanged in Oregon City. And that, we hope, we will also unveil in 2023. So if we survive the 25th anniversary and all the projects, including Walla Walla Plaza, we're working with Aaron Wells on the Walla Walla Library expansion. We're excited about what's coming in the next couple of years. There's a lot of work. Yeah.
Is there any kind of movement towards restoring some of the original names? Why do we call them Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, Mount Rainier? Why not use the traditional names as was done with Denali?
Well, interestingly enough, let me just give you some background. So the question is about restoring place names. So we did restore a place name, and it's a fascinating, it's one of my favorite place names. I'll go back to the image. It's a colorful story. Let's see. This, if I select, how do I select that? Thank you. So this image down here is up what used to be called Squaw Creek Overlook. And the name, one of our tribal members, this was long before Squaw place name replacement projects started happening in Oklahoma, Montana, Oregon. She wanted us to change that name, and so there was a vote of the tribe's general council, and there were four. There's Squaw Creek Overlook, Squaw Creek, Little Squaw Creek, and a fourth name I can't think of at this moment. But those four names were all going to be changed based on the name Iskultpa, which has, like Tamástslikt, more consonants than vowels. And it's hard to say, but it's my favorite story. You might say it's a feminist story, but a woman, many sisters and family members were digging roots up in the Blue Mountains up here. And our enemies from the south, the Bannocks, or Northern Paiutes, raided those women and took captive those women on horseback. And one of the women who was taken captive was able, with a rope, to overcome, because she was on a horse with this man, while he was trying to take her south to his country, overtook him with the rope and knocked him off the horse and drug him until his head fell off. Now, Iskultpa, one of our linguists called it the place of beheading. It's like, that's very polite. As if there was a knife involved. It's much more polite than imagery. But Iskultpa is the place of beheading up there. And it's not really because we were massacring pioneers or anything that interesting. It's a story of a really brave tribal woman who was then considered a warrior amongst the men when she came back because she had saved her own life and killed the enemy. And so it's a really colorful story. But Iskultpa, there's still no sign up there. We voted to change that more than 10 years ago. There's still no signage, and I'm not sure if the Oregon Department of Transportation is just avoiding the issue of how to make it a sign. There's plenty of signs all over Hawaii in Hawaiian language. They figured out how to use the diacritic marks, the apostrophe, and the accent, but we have yet to prevail. Now, we do have success in replacing about 20-some place names in Oregon that had this, in our homeland, that had the Squaw name on them. So we have had success in getting the GNIS, the Geographic Information System, that is what people rely on for maps and homework. The GNIS system has a lot of our place names in it now, at least 40 locations, but they're not on signs yet.
It does say historical location.
It does.
Doesn't give it a name. So
No.
you can find it.
Yeah, you can.
Off-ramp is.
Yes, if you know where to find it, it's there, and there's a little overlook sign. But so it's still in our future. I just try to be optimistic and hope that we will get there someday. I hope. Other comments or questions? Yes?
Yeah, you showed the picture of the Lula stone. You said it's in the Veterans Memorial?
Yeah, right in the middle of our sort of our Umatilla Basin housing complexes. So if you were to come on Highway 11 and take the turnoff to go to Mission Market and get to Mission Market and take a left and go up past the old Indian Agency buildings, about a quarter of a mile, you would see a walled sort of circle stone feature that's got gates on it. They're always open. And in the middle of that is the Wallula Stone, but that's our Veterans Memorial. It's right in the center of that. It has a flagpole. You'll see it right there. It's by the gym.
Going back to the question, what about Mission? I understand the history of why that area is called Mission, but does it not have an older place name of its own?
Well, actually, there are multiple names. So depending on where you talk about specifically, and we could pull up the place name map, but so there was a Presbyterian mission, which is south of there, and a Catholic mission, which is further up the hill from there. It's really sort of the mission road, is the road to the mission, the Catholic mission specifically, where Crow Shadow Institute is. But it's our neighboring tribe call us Nihiawe Pama, people of Nihiawe. And Nihiawe is the Aspen Springs. And the Aspen Spring is a specific location across the river near Kirkpatrick Road, but people have made it sort of a polygon name and applied it to sort of that whole area, Pendleton to Cayuse, is sort of Nihiawe Pama. And the name of Pendleton was Talalpa, which is a little cliffs place. And if you look at Pendleton close enough, especially down from the river, it's a place of little cliffs. And that's what its original name is. And I don't know whether we'll get there yet, but we might.
The school there is in Nihiawe.
Nihiawe, yes. I was in a van with people going to a meeting on the other side of the state, and we, at a rest area on I-5, I don't remember where, a school bus emptied, and the coach that got off that school bus said, "You guys are from Nick's country." And it's like, 'cause that's short for Nihiawe. And he said, "Yeah, we play them in sports. You've got good teams up there." And he went into the rest area. And I was like, okay. But yeah, Nick's, it was his sort of shortened name for us. New name for us, Nick's. And actually, if we say Nich, it means good, so that's not bad. Other comments or questions? So Gary Lentz, I want to recognize it. Gary Lentz has done lots of workshops and camps with us and lots of storytelling with us. And one of the things that he helps us point out is that Lewis and Clark had a penchant for renaming things after potential wives, girlfriends, members of the expedition. You know, Lewis's River, Clark's River, LePage's River, that kind of thing. And some of those names stuck, some of them didn't. Snake River is not Lewis's River anymore. But the penchant for renaming had a lot to do with the fact that they didn't actually know the names of the rivers or the places in our language, like the mix-up about Walla Walla being a river, not the people. So it's there in the history. We love Lewis and Clark because no two names are ever spelled the same way twice, except Lewis and Clark.
They were making maps. They had to call it something.
Well, Clark was making a lot of maps, and he's the guy that we sort of all kind of go back to and rely on in the storytelling. Not that Lewis wasn't a good documentarian, but what he was documenting was languages, interestingly enough. At what's now Sacagawea State Park, where they camped for 3 days to dry off all the stuff that they dumped in the Snake River, he was writing down vocabularies, and I think he said he heard 3 distinct languages there. And we're guessing he heard Cayuse, which is the old language, possibly one of the river languages, so either Northeast Sahaptian or Columbia River Sahaptian, so Walla Walla or Umatilla, more likely Walla Walla, and then Nez Perce probably. Chapunish or Chapunish. So he heard 3 languages and he was making vocabularies. And then Clark was more the map maker and the measuring guy. He's the one who said how many lodges there were and how many campfires there were and how tall they were and how wide they were and how many souls were there.
He frequently wrote the names on the maps.
Yes.
And he would use names of the people that lived in the area.
He used the names, Yes, and they weren't wrong sometimes. They got some of them close. Well, what's interesting is that no one had a convention for writing our language until recently. We only recently adopted an orthography, but there are no R's or F's or B's or V's in our alphabet. We have multiple X's. We represent the L in multiple forms. C means, so in our orthography, what Lewis and Clark wrote when they wrote an R in something like the Tah-MAHST-slickt, the name of the Nez, what are the Nez Perce men with them? It's probably a ch or a ch or a ch sound that they're trying to represent, because the convention of the day was that if they were writing something that was like in French, they would use that R sound to put in to represent a sound they couldn't make in English. It's a plug. Yeah. So. Other comments or questions? Getting hungry?
What's the significance of a double vowel, like a double I or a double A or something like that?
It's like putting the long bar above it in the dictionary. It makes it longer. It's a long A or a long A. So in the Aoki dictionary for Nez Perce, it'll have an A and a dot, meaning AA, or an O and a dot, meaning OO. So that's an U sound. And a U sound would have to have a second U. So Walulapum, so the lu part of it, because it's an elongated vowel, would be UU, Walula. Yeah, so you're looking at Itziaya. So in Nez Perce, this is how you say coyote, Itziaya. And so this is I short, sa, ya, yeah. So it's the longer vowel. Forgive me, I didn't realize that was up there, so.
To make things even more complicated, Clark spelled like Sacagawea 23 times,
Yeah,
but there were no dictionaries here.
right. And it could have been 3 different tribal languages.
Exactly. There were no dictionaries for the English language.
And
So you spelled things whatever it sounded.
well, and more complicated than that, only 6 members of the expedition could read and write, and most people who were Americans in the colonies at that point didn't read and write. So reading and writing for everybody is pretty common now, but not as common then. Not at all.
There was no public education.
Right, right. There was no public education. One of the privileges of our country. So thank you. I'm guessing you're getting hungry.